March 15, 2019. Margaret Chen had driven past the starving mare every morning for 6 days. The horse stood in the middle of Highway 14, refusing to move despite traffic, weather, and animal control efforts. Maggie knew that stretch of road better than anyone. It was where her daughter Sarah had died 15 years ago. What Maggie didn't know was that the horse carried rope burns from the Double R Ranch, the same ranch where she'd witnessed a murder in 1987 and stayed silent to protect her family. The same ranch Sarah had been investigating before her accident. When Maggie finally approached the mare, she saw something that changed everything. Carved into the horse's hoof was a message Sarah had left before she died. A message that proved someone had been watching Maggie for 32 years, waiting for her to return to this exact spot. The horse wasn't lost. She was delivering a confession. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie's hands trembled as she knelt beside the mare's front hoof, her breath forming small clouds in the March morning air. The carved letters were crude but deliberate, MC Vault 14. Sarah's initials intertwined with her own, followed by numbers that made Maggie's blood run cold. Vault 14. The abandoned mine shaft on Double R property where she'd buried her silence 32 years ago. The mare's dark eyes fixed on Maggie with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Around them, Highway 14 stretched empty in both directions, but Maggie could hear the distant rumble of an approaching 18-wheeler. She should move the horse, should call Sheriff Morrison again, should do anything except stare at this impossible message from her dead daughter. Easy, girl. Maggie's veterinarian instincts kicked in despite her racing mind. The mare's ribs showed through her dull coat like fence posts, and the rope burns around her neck had healed into ugly scars. Someone had kept this horse tied for months, maybe years. How did you get here? The carved message hadn't been there 6 days ago when animal control first tried to move the mare. Maggie was certain of it. She'd examined every inch of this horse through her binoculars from the safety of her truck, noting the brand, the malnutrition, the obvious signs of abuse. But the carving was fresh, the edges still sharp against the dark hoof wall, which meant someone had been here. Recently. A chill that had nothing to do with Wyoming's late winter ran down Maggie's spine. She glanced toward the tree line that bordered the highway, scanning for movement, for the glint of binoculars or a rifle scope. The same paranoia that had driven her from the Double R Ranch in 1987 flooded back like muscle memory. The 18-wheeler's horn blared as it crested the hill, and Maggie instinctively moved to shield the mare. But the horse didn't budge, didn't even flinch as the massive truck downshifted and pulled into the opposite lane, the driver leaning on his horn and shouting obscenities out his window. "What are you protecting?" Maggie whispered, running her hand along the mare's neck. The horse's brand was barely visible beneath the matted hair, but Maggie would recognize those interlocking R's anywhere. Richard Rawlings had burned that mark into more than just cattle. He'd branded this entire town with his influence, his money, his carefully cultivated image as a pillar of the community. But Maggie knew what she'd seen in Vault 14 all those years ago. Blood on Richard's hands, James Whitaker's body disappearing into that mine shaft along with any hope of justice, and her own cowardice, choosing her family's safety over speaking the truth. Now Sarah was gone too. Had been gone for 15 years, ever since her car had supposedly skidded off this same stretch of highway during a late spring snowstorm. The investigation had been brief, conclusive, driver error, poor visibility, tragic accident, case closed. Except Sarah had been the most careful driver Maggie knew, had driven these roads her entire life, and 2 weeks before her death she'd started asking questions about her mother's time at Double R Ranch, questions about James Whitaker's disappearance, questions about why Maggie had left veterinary practice so suddenly in 1987. Questions that apparently someone had decided were too dangerous to answer. Maggie's phone buzzed against her hip. Sheriff Morrison, probably responding to another motorist complaint about the horse. She let it go to voicemail, her attention fixed on the carving in the mare's hoof. The numbers bothered her. Not just 14 for Vault 14, but the way they were etched, deliberate, purposeful, like coordinates. Clever girl, Maggie breathed, understanding flooding through her. You're not just delivering a message, "You're delivering Sarah." The mare nickered softly, as if in agreement. For the first time in 6 days, she took a step, not away from the highway, but toward the narrow dirt access road that led into the hills, toward Double R Ranch property, toward Vault 14. Maggie's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number, time to finish what she started. Sundown. Come alone. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to load this horse into her trailer and disappear like she should have done 15 years ago, like she should have done in 1987. But Sarah's message carved into living flesh told a different story. Her daughter had been braver than Maggie ever was, had been willing to face the truth even if it killed her, which it had. The mare took another step toward the hills, and this time Maggie followed. Whatever Sarah had discovered about Double R Ranch, whatever had gotten her killed, it was waiting in Vault 14. And after 32 years of running, 15 years of grief, and 6 days of watching this horse stand vigil over her daughter's death, Maggie Chen was finally ready to stop being afraid. The morning sun cast long shadows across the asphalt as woman and horse left Highway 14 behind, walking together toward a reckoning 3 decades in the making. The dirt road felt foreign beneath Maggie's boots after 6 days of standing on asphalt. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that caught in the morning light, and she found herself walking in rhythm with the mare's careful gait. The horse moved like she knew exactly where she was going. Her ears pricked forward despite the obvious pain in her movements. Maggie's rescue ranch lay 5 miles in the opposite direction, a modest collection of weathered barns and paddocks that had been her sanctuary for the past 15 years. 12 horses currently called it home, mostly aged geldings and mares that nobody else wanted, survivors of neglect and abandonment that she'd nursed back from the brink. She thought of them now, waiting for their morning hay, and felt a pang of guilt. Elena Vasquez, her part-time hand, wouldn't arrive until noon. The horses would be fine until then, but routine mattered to damaged animals. They needed to trust that food would come, that someone would show up, the same way Sarah had trusted that her mother would protect her. "Stop," Maggie whispered to herself, pushing down the familiar spiral of guilt. But walking this road, following this horse toward Double R property, brought everything rushing back. Sarah at 8 years old, perched on the fence rail while Maggie worked with a rescued Mustang. Sarah at 16, arguing that she wanted to study journalism, not veterinary medicine. Sarah at 27, showing up unannounced at the ranch with questions about the past that Maggie had refused to answer. "Why did you really leave Double R, Mom? What happened to that man, James Whitaker? Why do you get that look on your face whenever anyone mentions the Rawlings family?" The mare stumbled slightly, and Maggie automatically reached out to steady her. The horse's shoulder was nothing but bone and hide stretched too tight, but there was muscle memory there. This had been a well-trained animal once, probably beautiful before someone decided to use rope and fear to break her spirit. "I know the feeling," Maggie murmured, running her hand along the mare's neck. Her fingers found the old rope burns, thick scar tissue that spoke of months or years of struggle. Someone had kept this horse tied short, probably without adequate food or water. The cruelty was methodical, purposeful, like everything the Rawlings family did. They crested a small rise, and the ranch buildings came into view in the distance. Maggie's chest tightened at the sight of them. The sprawling main house with its wraparound porch, the pristine white fences that stretched to the horizon, the cluster of barns and outbuildings that represented the kind of operation she'd once dreamed of working for. Before she'd learned that some dreams came with a price too high to pay, her phone rang. This time she answered without looking at the display. "Maggie, where the hell are you?" Sheriff Morrison's voice carried irritation and concern in equal measure. "I've got reports that you and that horse just wandered off into the hills. You can't just—" "I'm handling it, Jack." "Handling what?" "Maggie, I've known you for 15 years. You don't wander off without a plan. What's going on?" Jack Morrison had been Sarah's friend in high school before he'd become sheriff, had been one of the pallbearers at her funeral, had told Maggie more than once that something about the accident report bothered him, but that his hands were tied without new evidence. Good man, but not good enough to go up against the Rawlings family on gut instinct alone. "The horse has old rope burns," Maggie said, watching the mare's ears swivel toward the ranch buildings. "Deliberate abuse. And that brand is from Double R." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, Maggie, Richard Rawlings died 3 years ago. Heart attack, remember? Whatever happened between you two back in the day? Richard Jr. runs things now, and he's a respected member of this community. I can't have you making accusations without proof. Proof. That's what everyone always wanted. Proof that couldn't disappear into abandoned mine shafts or get labeled as tragic accidents. Proof that men like the Rawlings couldn't buy or bury. I'll call you later, Maggie said, ending the call. The mare had stopped walking and was staring toward a cluster of cottonwoods about half a mile ahead. Maggie squinted, trying to see what had caught the horse's attention, and felt her blood chill. A figure stood among the trees, too distant to make out clearly, but definitely watching them, waiting. Maggie's ranch felt very far away now. Elena and the horses, the quiet life she'd built from the wreckage of her past, the careful routine that kept the nightmares at bay, all of it suddenly seemed as fragile as old newspaper. She thought of the envelope in her kitchen drawer, the one labeled for Sarah that contained her confession, her evidence, her cowardice documented in careful handwriting, insurance she'd never had the courage to use. The figure among the cottonwoods raised one hand, not a wave, but an acknowledgement, a summons. The mare nickered softly and began walking again, carrying Maggie toward whatever truth was worth killing for. The mare's pace quickened as they approached the cottonwoods, and Maggie felt her heart hammering against her ribs. 32 years melted away with each step, taking her back to a younger woman who believed that truth mattered more than power, that justice existed for people like her. The figure stepped out from behind the largest tree, and Maggie's world tilted sideways. "Hello, Maggie." James Whitaker looked older, grayer, worn down by 3 decades of hiding, but unmistakably alive. The man she'd watched Richard Rawlings murder in 1987, the man whose disappearance had driven her from Double R Ranch and into a silence that had poisoned everything she'd touched since. "You're dead." The words came out as barely a whisper. "I saw him kill you." "You saw him try." James touched a scar that ran from his left ear to his collar, a pale line that hadn't been there in 1987. But that mine shaft had a second tunnel. Rawlings Sr. never was as thorough as he thought. The mare had stopped beside James, lowering her head as his weathered hand found her muzzle. The gesture was familiar, intimate. This horse knew him, trusted him. "She's yours," Maggie said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "Before they took her, before they used her to get to Sarah." His voice carried a weight of grief that matched her own. "I tried to warn your daughter, Maggie. Tried to tell her to stop digging. But she was just like you, too stubborn to listen." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "Sarah came to you?" 3 months before she died. Found me living in that old line shack near Vault 14. Been hiding there for years, documenting everything. The cattle rustling, the insurance fraud, the way they've been bleeding this county dry while everyone calls them pillars of the community. James pulled a battered envelope from his jacket. She was going to publish it. Had a contact at the Denver Post, someone who specialized in exposing corruption in small towns. Maggie's knees went weak. All those questions Sarah had asked, all the times she'd pressed for details about the past. She hadn't been seeking closure. She'd been building a case. The night she died, James continued, his hand never leaving the mare's neck, she came to get the evidence. Said she had enough to bring down the whole operation, but she needed my testimony, needed me to come forward. And you said no. The words tasted like ash. I said yes. His eyes met hers, and she saw the same haunted look that stared back at her from mirrors, told her I was tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. We were supposed to meet the next morning, drive to Denver together. The highway stretched below them, a ribbon of asphalt that had claimed her daughter's life. Maggie could see the exact spot where Sarah's car had left the road, where investigators had found skid marks and broken glass, and a young woman's dreams scattered across the frozen ground. They were waiting for her, she said. Richard Jr. and 2 of his men. I watched it happen from the ridge, saw them force her off the road, then stage the scene to look like an accident. By the time I got down there, it was too late. James's voice broke. I managed to get to her car before the sheriff arrived, grabbed the evidence she'd gathered. But I couldn't save her. The mare lifted her head and fixed Maggie with those dark, knowing eyes. This horse had been there, had watched Sarah die, had somehow understood that she needed to carry a message, to stand vigil until someone listened. Why now? Maggie's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Why come forward after 15 years? James handed her the envelope. Because Richard Jr.'s getting sloppy, getting desperate. The ranch is hemorrhaging money, and he's planning something big, something that'll hurt a lot of innocent people. He paused, studying her face. And because your daughter made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd make sure you knew the truth. She said you'd spent too many years blaming yourself for things that weren't your fault. Maggie's hands shook as she took the envelope. Sarah's handwriting covered the front. For Mom, the truth will set us both free. Inside, she found photographs, bank records, witness statements. A paper trail that connected the Rawlings family to cattle theft, insurance fraud, and the systematic intimidation of anyone who threatened their operation. Names she recognized, other ranchers who died in accidents, investigators who'd been transferred or discredited, journalists whose stories had been killed before publication, and at the bottom of the stack, a letter in Sarah's careful script. Mom, if you're reading this, then you know I didn't die in an accident. I know you've been carrying guilt about what happened at Double R, but it's time to stop running. James has proof of everything. Proof that Dad's death wasn't random either. The Rawlings have been destroying families for decades, and we're the only ones who can stop them. I love you. Be brave. The words blurred as tears she'd held back for 15 years finally broke free. Her husband David's death in Iraq hadn't been the random tragedy she'd believed. It had been connected to his investigation of military supply contracts, contracts that traced back to Double R subsidiaries, everything. They'd taken everything from her. What do you need me to do? She asked. James folded the envelope back into his jacket, his movements careful and deliberate. You need to walk away, Maggie. Take your horse and go home. My horse? She's yours now. Has been since the moment she recognized you on that highway. His weathered face creased with something that might have been regret. But the rest of this, Sarah's evidence, my testimony, you can't be part of it, not anymore. The dismissal stung worse than she'd expected. Sarah was my daughter, which is exactly why you need to stay out of this. James stepped back, putting distance between them. I've got contacts now, people who can't be bought or intimidated. Federal investigators who've been building cases against operations like Double R for years. Sarah's evidence is just the missing piece they needed. Maggie stared at him, confusion mixing with a familiar anger that had been simmering for 3 decades. You're cutting me out. I'm keeping you alive. The sharpness in his voice made the mayor's ears flick backward. You think Richard Jr. doesn't know you're here? You think he hasn't been watching your ranch, your movements, every person you talked to since this horse showed up? The paranoia she'd been fighting clawed its way back to the surface. Those times over the past week when she'd felt eyes on her. The sensation of being followed when she drove to town for supplies. The way conversations had stopped when she'd entered Miller's feed store, replaced by uncomfortable silences and averted gazes. He knows, she whispered. Course he knows. Question is whether he sees you as a threat worth eliminating or just a broken old woman who learned to keep her mouth shut. James's tone was brutal in its honesty. Right now, you walking away keeps you in the second category. The mayor nudged against Maggie's shoulder, a gentle pressure that somehow felt like Sarah's touch. 15 years of carefully constructed safety crumbled around her as she realized how naive she'd been, how visible, how vulnerable she'd made herself by even coming this far. Take the horse and go, James said again. Let me handle the rest. But even as he spoke, the sound of engines drifted across the valley. 2 vehicles, maybe 3, climbing the dirt road they'd just walked, moving fast enough to kick up dust clouds that hung in the still air like smoke signals. James cursed under his breath and stepped deeper into the cottonwoods. They're early. Who's early? But Maggie already knew. The same sick feeling that had driven her from Double R 32 years ago settled into her stomach like a stone. James's voice carried an urgency that made her blood chill. Cut through Miller's pasture, stay off the roads. And Maggie, whatever happens, don't come back for me. The engines were closer now, close enough that she could distinguish the deep rumble of trucks from the higher whine of an ATV. close enough to know that whoever was coming wasn't interested in conversation. Maggie grabbed the mare's halter, but the horse resisted, ears pinned back toward the approaching vehicles. For 6 days, this animal had stood perfectly still on that highway, refusing to be moved by anyone. Now she was balking again, as if she understood that running meant abandoning something precious. She won't leave you, Maggie realized. James looked at the mare with an expression so raw it hurt to witness. She's been trying to bring you here for weeks, standing on that highway, making herself visible, making people talk. She knew you'd come eventually, because I'm the only one left who witnessed what happened in '87. Because you're the only one Sarah trusted to finish what she started. He pressed something into her hand, a small digital recorder worn smooth from handling. Everything's on there. My testimony, names, dates, locations. Sarah died trying to get this to the right people. The first truck crested the hill, close enough now that Maggie could make out the double R logo on its door, close enough to see the rifle rack in the rear window. James! Go! She tugged the mare's lead rope, and this time the horse followed, but reluctantly, looking back over her shoulder toward the man who'd kept her secrets for so long. They crashed through the underbrush at the edge of the cottonwood grove, branches catching at Maggie's jacket, thorns scraping against the mare's already scarred hide. Behind them, truck doors slammed, male voices sharp with authority and barely controlled anger. One voice she recognized from town council meetings and church socials, Richard Rawlings Jr., pillar of the community, carrying on the family tradition. Whitaker, we know you're here. The mare stumbled on the uneven ground, her weakened condition making flight nearly impossible. They wouldn't make it to Miller's fence line, let alone to safety. Maggie pressed the recorder deeper into her pocket and made a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff. She was done running.